My full name is Christopher, middle initials Z for zero. Hobson, Hobson. I'm 83 years old, born in New York City and resident in New York City. I think the key things here are, on the one side, I was born into a middle-class family, a single mother, but my mother was a well-known author at the time, Laura Z. Hobson. And I went to private schools, went to Harvard as an undergraduate, graduated from there. So we're talking about a privileged upbringing. And on the other hand, aside from my mother being sort of a super liberal person and active in various things like bringing refugees over from West Germany before the war, her parents, my grandparents, whom I never met, they died before I was born, were Russian Jewish socialist immigrants who moved to the United States in the 1880s, learned Yiddish in the United States because it wasn't spoken in southern Russia, and worked in the Jewish labor movement their entire lives, Jewish socialist and labor movements. So that was a background influence, sort of away from elite stuff. And the other thing just worth mentioning is I became aware quite early of being homosexual, and that made me a moral outsider, particularly in the atmosphere in the 1950s, but it would even make me a moral outsider today. So both of those things had a kind of, non-standard privileged background effect. And the other thing to mention is, I guess your next question is going to be about, I'm not sure where career and stuff comes in, but I didn't have a career in the ordinary sense until probably my 50s. I graduated from college, took a post-graduation year in Africa, which was an extremely important year in my life, and was active both before graduating and for most of the time after graduating in small left-wing organizations and efforts up to about 1989. And around that time, I decided, I'm now, what was I, in my late 40s, 1989. I have the second part of my life to think about, and I want to do something else. I took a PhD and began teaching at SUNY State University of New York, College at Old Westbury, where I've been ever since. I'm going to retire in a year. I mean, to be brief about it, first of all, I didn't become an anarchist in any sense for a long time. I began as a college undergraduate working on very, very cautious, limited peace initiatives, something called tension reduction, if you can accommodate that. However, it was also the period of, it was before the anti-war movement, which grew up. I graduated in 1963. The anti-war movement really began after the escalation of Vietnam in 1964. But it was the time of the early civil rights movement, and although I was not active in that, there were regional travelers who came around all the time. And I got to know many of the people who were working in the South, and that was a big influence on me. at any rate, one of the major things that was organized in that time was a march in front of the White House that some of us organized back in, I think, October 1862, that's what I'm remembering. That was 7,000 people, which was a huge number for the time. President Kennedy sent out coffee to us. We had a debate as to whether we should accept coffee before he was dead. So that was that. And then there was the year in Tanganyika, which I just mentioned. That was a Harvard undergraduate volunteer program, not Peace Corps, but doing some of the same things that Peace Corps did. And it had, I think, two sort of slightly contradictory effects on my thinking. One was, this was the first time in my life that I'd been out of the United States in what we would now call a third world country. The irrelevance of Cold War politics was totally evident. These were people trying to pull themselves in their country up from, third world status to second world status, something like that. And that was it. But the other thing that was also important, it became obvious later when the politics of the student movement in the US became very Stalinist. The other thing that was also important was the United States Constitution, the existence of the Supreme Court. I can remember a dialogue with some students that I was close to during that time in Tanganyika. When somebody mentioned something that President Kennedy might do, I don't know what it was. And I said, I don't think he would do it because I think the Supreme Court wouldn't allow it. And even in a quite non-authoritarian African country like Tanganyika, no personality cult, etc. Even there, the idea that there was a court that could tell the president that you can't do something was revelatory to these kids. And I always remembered that when people made excuses for Cuba, let's say, saying, the people own, the fact that it was in the press, so there's no need with courts, civil liberties, et cetera, et cetera. So those were some influences. Back in the United States, I did some interrupted graduate work at the University of Chicago. Was eventually expelled into I think, third sitting. And worked with SDS, which I don't have to explain to you. When SDS split in 1969 and then, supposed halves of the plank to foot, basically. I began working with very small but socialist groups, and I know some of the people from the Utopia interviewed probably have the same background. So we joined something that was then called the International Socialists, split a few years later, and that group with something called the Revolutionary Socialist League. That lasted for 20-some years until 1989. It wasn't getting any bigger, and engineered a merger on the basis of anarchism with something called, what they call it, rabble in some way, but I'm forgetting what the initials quite stood for. But we became the Love and Rage Revolutionary Anarchist Federation. That lasted about 10 years. And late 90s, as best I can remember, the other group in that was becoming increasingly Maoist. I mean, several of us launched utopian magazine, now basically a sort of online talk group, doesn't really have a public presence to speak of it anymore. So that's some of my history. And around that time, I did become an anarchist, but with, I would say, certain healthy reservations. I had never seen for sure how one can have a society without some form of state, some form of government, et cetera, et cetera. And my basic attitude towards anarchism is I don't believe in capitalism or any of the capitalist parties. I don't believe in, socialism, so-called, and therefore there needs to be another course. That's anarchism. And I do have differences with the people that you may have interviewed in Utopia, in that fair. Well, not all of them, but many of them, their common response to the January 6th, 21 events at the Capitol was, "Oh, gee, this is great. Look at all these people chasing Speaker Pelosi out of the Capitol, et cetera, et cetera." And I thought and still think that A, it was a serious attempt to overturn the elections, and B, it was a practice shot for what has become the second Trump presidency. So that's a real difference. And my relationship with the Utopian group has been sort of critical and participating on only a slight basis since then. I would describe it that, first of all, in class terms. That is, we're talking about some kind of a structure that is based on local and really local, national, and international rank and file people. And the American system certainly is, in any guard and under either party, is essentially an elite apparatus over and above the people, which people get to vote every 4 years for somewhat meaningless alternatives. The most meaningless of which, by the way, were Trump versus Harris this last time. And on the other hand, for a long time, I would have defined myself as a dissident communist or like that. And that dealt out of me in Visit to Poland in 1987. Tiny little group there called Freedom and Peace. And again, the week that I spent there, as they had an international conference, they were an anarchist pacifist group. They were able to meet only because somebody in the church, bucking higher ups, gave them the church venue in the government. Didn't want to actually march into a church and arrest people, although we were afraid that they would cut off access on the streets. But on the second morning of that conference, I had stayed overnight with an ex-Solidarity person who was now working as a taxi driver. And he was helping me find my way back to the conscience by bus, waiting at a bus stop. Some 15-year-old, scrub boy came up with a solicitation for something. And this guy let out with a scream of abuse to the boy which the only word I understood was communist. And the boy just totally wilted under that. So I stopped describing myself as a dissident audience. So that's about it. Yes. That's a long way around the first question about how I describe. I think there's critical stating an alternative. And it's an idea situation, particularly, our group is a bunch of old people. And we're not going to be sparking whatever, activity goes on in the next 5 years, 4 years. Being like the orange turd, he's letting it orange. Let it in his own day. Good for me. Until we get him out of office. And I think he will. I think that's fears that Trump will actually institute dictatorship and abolish the Constitution. I think that misplaced. What the man is doing incredible damage. In any case, what we can do is to push forward some kind of an alternative in the terms of the talkative, but actual people getting together themselves to act on a mass level. The anti-war movement and the civil rights movement in 6 months are relevant examples. The labor movement in the 30s is relevant, but relevant. So I think that's it's a propaganda function, in other words. I guess the only thing, you had a question about sort of, for the future or like that. And I always think of Gordon Howe's fable about the village idiot in the shtetl who was assigned to watch the village gates and make an announcement when Messiah appeared. And after 30 years of this or so, someone came up and said, "You're a fucking idiot, but Messiah is never going to appear." And he said, "Well, it's study work." So, that's kind of my sense of being any kind of radical and certainly being an anarchist. This being the other. Let me just back up a little. It was one thing I did not mention is academic work. And my publishing has been on a variety of different topics, but William Blake has been a centerpiece. Published 2 books of my own on Blake, anthology, published several articles in recent years of working on probably a book manuscript now. And Blake is kind of the closest thing in English literature to philosophical elements, which for him is based on a religious vision and based on the idea of a society without any form of government, but is held together by forgiveness of sins. So that is, I think, always a colorful kind of anarchism. So that's out of order, but I think it's very effective.